This is the First Energy Glen barn. It's a bank barn, which means it was built into the hillside. It was built in 1858 and has a timber frame construction with mortise and tenon joints, wooden pegs, and hand-hewn logs. We call this barn the First Energy Glen barn because First Energy donated the barn and is a major financial contributor to the project. The barn came from the Glen farm. Now, the barn didn't always look like this. When we were ready to get it, it was in pretty bad shape. The siding was falling off, the roof was in bad condition, and the foundation we thought was pretty good, but found out later that it was pretty bad. So we hired an Amish contractor to come out and disassemble the barn, move it. Then when they got to the location, they restored any of the beams that needed restored. Then they reassembled the barn's timber frame here on a new foundation. And then we had new siding put on and a new roof. Now you'll notice that there's a dormer here. That's not original. We added the dormer plus all the windows and the louvers because we have a green initiative to help light and keep cool the barn. So that's why you see a little bit of the change. So I'd like to take you inside right now and give you a little bit more idea of what the barn looks like inside. Here at the village, we have the barn and we have preserved some of the history. Now, in the barn, what we have is some things that you would see back in the 1800s of that period time, and things that you would see in the barn, so people can come in and see what different things would be in a barn at that time and experience some of the things that would be happening in the 1800s. But really the main thing is the barn itself. Now, I said before that it was hand-hewn construction, and we have the hand-hewn beams with a timber frame, and that's what's so important about this barn, is that they don't build barns like this anymore. You can get a timber frame barn built, but it would be pretty much with a sawmill sawed logs, so you won't have the hand-hewn marks, and whenever they put them together, they probably still can mortise and tenon and put the wooden pegs. But everything that you see here in this barn back in 1858 was handmade. So whenever they hand-hewn the logs, they had to go and cut the trees down. Then they had to hand-hew it like Harold had showed you. Then they had to bring the logs here and raise the barn. Now, all the work that they did, like Harold was showing you, everything was handmade. So they didn't have power tools to come in and drill the holes or do anything. So this is a part of history that once this is gone, you're never going to see this again. And there is what's being called a crisis in America, where these types of barns are disappearing in the American landscape. And we had an opportunity to save a timber frame barn with hand-hewn logs, and we went for it and we were able to save it. So now people can come and see not only the different things that would be found in the barn, but also the barn itself. Now in the barn we have 4 main beams that run lengthwise of the barn, and they're 60 feet in length, and they're all one piece. So that means that each one of those 60 feet beams came from a tree that has a trunk length of over 60 feet, which is a pretty tall tree. And I can't imagine being back in the 1800s, cutting down a tree like that, and then working it and bringing it in and lifting it and getting it all put together. Now, we had hired the Amish to go and disassemble the barn and bring it over here and restore it and reassemble it. But at the same time, what we also did, we knew we weren't going to be able to save the foundation that was there. It just was in bad condition, and you just couldn't move that foundation over here. And the main thing is the timber frame. That's what we really wanted to show. So we did have a modern foundation put in place here to put the barn on. And then when the crew came with the timber frame, they went through, and anything that was damaged, they went ahead and fixed that and then started the process of putting everything back together. Now, to start off, when they started to take the barn apart, the very first thing that the Amish did was they came in and they took pictures of every single part of the barn, and there was an aluminum tab with a number on every single beam and every single post. What that allowed them to do was, once they tore everything down, all they had to do was look at the picture, and they knew where all the pieces were supposed to go back together. So when it came time to put everything together, they started laying things out, they looked at the picture, they knew which numbers they had to go get, and they went and got those different pieces and put them together. And it was quite interesting to watch the actual process of all this. Now, when they showed up at the barn, we had already had most of the siding taken down, so they didn't have to deal with that. And the floorboards were already loose. So they had to start on the roof. Now the roof, we were not going to save because we wanted to have a new roof put on, so they could just take the old metal roofing off and we were going to have a new metal roof put on its place. So then they started to take the rafters down. Now rafters are just boards that are put in place that make the roof go to a point. And here in this barn, they're all trees, and they're hand-hewn trees that are about this big around. And so then the Amish started taking all those off, and then they got down to the timber frame. Well, we were only able to get a crane for one day to take the timber frame apart. And to take the timber frame apart, every single wooden peg that you see in this barn had to be removed. So they had to go and either pull it out with a crowbar or take a drill and drill all of the pegs out. Once they were ready to do that, and got them out, they brought the crane in and just started taking sections by sections. They would lift them, lay them on the ground, go to the next section, and they just had to get everything down in the one day that they had the crane. Then they came back and started disassembling the entire timber frame that was down on the ground and loaded it up on the tractor trailer to get it over to here. When it did get over to here, we were just about ready to have the barn reassembled onto the foundation. That crew was finishing up this foundation here, and the Amish started going through the different beams and supports to see what damage was done, and they had to do some restoration and some fixing of the beams and posts. Now, once they got that done, it was time to go ahead and start putting the barn back together. So what they did was they got one of the pictures and they figured out that they needed to first put an inner wall right here, this side over here on the left as I'm standing in here. They put that up first. So they got the picture of that. They saw which timbers and frames that they needed, and they brought it all together and they put it together on the ground. Then they had the crane come in, lift it, and they put it in its place. Now, there was just some loose floor beams in here at the time because they didn't have the flooring down yet. So they really had to watch how they were stepping so they wouldn't fall through. So they had this first section put in, and they had temporary bracing holding it. Then they already had the outside section wall ready to go. So they raised it and put it in place and also used temporary bracing to hold it. Then they came over and they put this section in and then the last section. Now all of these sections of the timber frame were all held with temporary supports, and if the crane operator or if anything happened to hit one of the sections, it could have been like a domino effect and just pushed everything down. So luckily none of that happened. Everything was safe, and once they got the timber frame up and secured, then they had to bring in the 60-foot beams. Now the first two 60-foot pieces of beams, I think there's 15 mortise and tenon joints in each one of them, and it took a long time for them to get all the pieces in. The other thing that had happened was the timber frame has been inside for over 150 years, so it has been very, very dry. When we moved everything, it sat outside and it rained on it quite a few different days. That made the timber frames and the posts swell, so when it was to go back together, they had difficulty putting it back together. They got those two 60-foot beams put together, then they had to bring the other supports with the 60-foot beams in, and once they got all of that together, then it was time to put the rafters up. Now all of those were numbered, so they knew which ones to go get, and they put them in their places that they needed to do that. Then they put the roof sheeting on, and then they put on the metal roofing. Then we had decided to, since the siding needed to be replaced, we had hemlock. There was only about 2 places in the area that we could get the hemlock, so they got hemlock siding come in, and it was really close because it was near November, winter was starting to set in and the siding still wasn't here. Luckily we got it just in time, and they really worked hard and got all the siding in before winter. Now the center section of the flooring here, you'll see it looks like old wood, and it is. This is originally out of the barn. Then you'll see a lighter shade of boards here around the side. That is red oak. We had someone donate some red oak logs to us, and we had a portable sawmill, and we sawed the logs and made them into boards and put that down for the flooring. So as you come to the village, we hope that you visit the First Energy Glen Barn and see the different demonstrations and the different static displays that we have that shows what the life was back in the 1800s and how this barn would be used. But we also want you to actually look closely at the construction of the barn and just imagine back in the 1800s what it took for people to build something like this with nothing other than hand tools. We hope to see you come and visit our village soon.